Lauren McGraw had always believed in small things, and measured doses, and handwritten notes, and kindness offered without performance. The wooden counter beneath her fingertips had once felt like the center of the world. Now, it felt like the last outpost of something quietly vanishing. McGraw Pharmacy sat on the edge of Ironville's old district, where the sidewalks still buckled slightly with age and storefronts bore the faded charm of hand-painted signage. Hers was the last family-run pharmacy in a town that had once known nothing else. A blue glass bowl of wintergreen mints sat by the register, untouched. The analog scale near the door still worked if you nudged it just right. Everything in the shop bore the weight of use and memory. Lauren's life, too, had become a practice and routine. She woke each morning at 5:30, made oatmeal with cinnamon, and unlocked the pharmacy before the sun had fully breached the trees behind her building. Customers were fewer now, older ones mostly, the kind who still remembered her grandmother, still remembered when medicines came with handwritten instructions and a jar of honey from the backyard. At 40, Lauren had the face of someone who smiled more with her eyes than her lips. Her hair was always pulled back, and her clothes practical with jeans, collared shirts, a brown canvas apron with ink stains where pens had exploded mid-shift. She wore the same leather shoes every day, the soles nearly worn smooth. Her hands had small calluses from years of counting pills, stocking shelves, and mixing salves. She didn't mind the wear. It made her feel like she belonged to something honest. But lately, honesty hadn't been enough. For the past year, the city had been courting wellness conglomerates, sleek, sterile storefronts with digital kiosks, subscription plans, and lavender-scented branding. They didn't carry the obscure ointments rural farmers sometimes needed. They didn't know your name. They didn't ask how your mother was healing after surgery. But they had logos. And investors. And shiny new promises. Mayor Martin Drayden, elected on a platform of bringing Ironville forward, had made it his personal crusade to replace what he called legacy inefficiencies with modern alternatives. There was a plan, drafted by consultants from out of state, to level half of the historic district and rezone the land for health tech offices and designer supplement shops. McGraw Pharmacy sat squarely in the path of progress. Lauren had received the first warning letter 9 months ago. The wording had been polite, official, cold. Non-compliance with updated commercial code. Inconsistent alignment with future development. Violation of storefront uniformity. She had posted it on the backroom bulletin board, next to a decades-old recipe for elderberry syrup and her grandmother's scribbled reminder to always call patients by their first name. She had written a letter in response. Then another. Then attended a town hall where she was the only person not wearing a suit. Each time, her voice was calm, even when they talked over her. Even when someone referred to her pharmacy as an emotional relic. She kept going. Quietly. Relentlessly. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the grain elevators to the west, she was restocking the cold remedies aisle when she heard it. A low, rhythmic sound. Steady. Unmistakable. Hoofbeats. She stood still for a moment, the sound curling into her memory like steam from a winter mug. She had been a girl the last time she'd heard that sound outside this building, riding with her father during snowstorms, saddlebags clinking with bottles of penicillin and gauze. There had been a time when every rural pharmacy doubled as a first responder. When roads iced over, horses carried medicine where cars could not. Her father had been known across 5 counties for those rides. People used to say he smelled like peppermint and dust and always showed up when needed most. The sound grew louder, then stopped. She moved to the window, drawing back the lace curtain. In the amber light of a street lamp, a figure stood beside a black horse. The animal's breath fogged in the cold air, sides heaving from exertion. The man holding the reins was young, perhaps in his 20s. His boots were muddy to the ankle, and his coat was too thin for the temperature. He kept one hand steady on the horse's neck, the other gripping something close to his chest, perhaps a note or a wallet. Lauren's heart didn't race. It simply shifted. As if something had clicked back into place. She didn't need to guess why he was there. Not really. People didn't walk horses into downtown Ironville unless something mattered more than the rules. The mayor's ordinance had been clear: no animals on public streets, no exceptions. Something about aesthetic impact. The fine was steep. The enforcement swift. Last month, a farmer had been cited for tying a mule cart behind the church during a harvest fair. No leniency. No conversation. Lauren moved toward the door, her body calm with the certainty of someone who had already made the decision days before. She opened it and stepped into the cold. The wind caught the edge of her coat and lifted it slightly, as if bowing to what was coming. She walked toward the horse. The man looked up, his face pale from the wind but steady with intent. And though no words were spoken, the message was clear. Someone needed help. Again. And help, she knew, didn't wait for permission. The young man's name was Nick Harper, though Lauren only learned it later. That night, she knew him only by the way he stood, shoulders stiff against fear, eyes full of apology but not regret. The horse beside him was trembling. Its front leg bore a visible swelling, and thin flecks of dried sweat patterned its coat. The mare was in pain, and the cold wasn't helping. Lauren moved with quiet precision. She unlatched the alley gate behind the pharmacy and motioned for Nick to lead the animal through. No questions. No paperwork. Just the unspoken understanding that something needed doing, and it wasn't going to wait for approval. Inside the dimly lit backroom, the smell of antiseptic mixed with hay dust from the mare's coat. Lauren retrieved a veterinary-grade antibiotic from a locked cabinet, one she kept on hand for the rare but remembered moments when someone showed up needing more than what the modern world thought acceptable. She hadn't opened that cabinet in over a year. She administered the injection quickly. The mare flinched, then settled. Her breathing slowed. The worst was past. Nick was quiet the entire time. He hadn't expected anyone to help. Not here. Not now. Lauren handed him a small packet of powder and instructions scrawled on the back of an old receipt. Dosage, feeding, rest. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her eyes held what mattered, that rare kind of empathy that doesn't need to explain itself. But the world outside had already noticed. By the time Lauren and Nick returned to the alley, flashing lights bounced against the brick walls of the pharmacy. A black town car idled at the curb. News cameras, summoned by some alert or whisper, were already positioned. A microphone bobbed in the chilled air. The mayor's staff moved like a choreographed play. Mayor Martin Drayton stood at the center of it all, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and a public relations advisor in a wool coat too expensive for any weather that touched Ironville. The mayor's tie was perfect. His smile was brittle. Lauren saw the moment his eyes met hers. Calculated offense. He didn't need a scandal, he needed an example. He stepped forward. The camera lights followed. Nick instinctively placed himself between the horse and the gathering crowd, shielding the animal like a man who had been told too many times that life didn't care. But Lauren did not step back. She stepped forward. The mayor's voice rose, clear, authoritative, full of practiced outrage. He spoke of ordinances, violations, and public safety. He gestured toward the horse with a disdain that didn't need words. His voice echoed in the air, bouncing off brick and window like a gavel. Lauren listened. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she simply nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. Then she turned to Nick and told him to lead the horse through the alley and wait by the stables. Her voice was calm, even. The moment was small. But it was enough. The mayor's expression faltered. He hadn't expected resistance to look so quiet. He gestured to the officers, but they hesitated. One of them, an older man named O'Hara, had once brought his granddaughter to Lauren for help with an allergic reaction. He looked at her now and said nothing. Just lowered his hand. The mayor noticed. Lauren returned inside without ceremony. She didn't look back. By midnight, the footage was on local news channels. The segment was short, pharmacy owner defies animal ordinance, but the image said more than the headline. A woman in a worn coat, standing between power and a shivering animal. There were no speeches. Just presence. Just the kind of dignity that unsettles people used to getting their way. Nick stayed by the stables that night. The mare slept standing, her pain dulled for now. He didn't leave her side. He didn't know that his arrival had set something larger into motion. At dawn, Lauren returned to the pharmacy to find a notice pinned to the door. A formal citation. She read it without emotion, then folded it and placed it beneath the glass paperweight shaped like a pine cone that had belonged to her grandmother. She resumed her work. Refilled prescriptions. Opened the blinds. Watered the potted fern that had nearly died during last summer's drought. The fern survived. Most things did, if someone bothered to care. By noon, word had spread. Customers came not to buy medicine, but to stand, some awkwardly, some fiercely, in a kind of half-silent solidarity. A retired schoolteacher brought a plate of cornbread. A teenager offered to sweep the sidewalk. An elderly man placed a single apple on the counter and walked away. The town was waking up. Somewhere in the outskirts, old boots stepped into stirrups. Phone calls were made. Saddles were buckled. Somewhere, a brass buckle was polished, and a coin was placed in a pocket where it had slept for years. Something had stirred. Something old. Something that remembered when hoofbeats were more than noise, and when standing up for what mattered didn't require permission, only courage. 1 month later, the streets of Ironville no longer looked like a town preparing to forget itself. Each first Saturday of the month, the old district came alive again, not with storefront discounts or digital kiosks, but with hoofbeats. Horses lined the curb, tied to newly installed iron hitching posts that gleamed against the brickwork. Children rode ponies in the lot behind the courthouse. Farmers sold eggs and hand-churned butter from the beds of antique trucks. And beneath a banner hand-stitched by a local quilting group, families gathered where they had once passed each other like strangers. They called it Equestrian Market Day. It hadn't been written into law by any councilman. It had simply happened. A protest turned into a gathering. A gathering turned into a ritual. And rituals, when they reach the hearts of enough people, become something stronger than policy. They become memory made visible. The pharmacy stayed open late on those Saturdays. Not because Lauren needed the sales, though business had quietly improved, but because she had become something different in the eyes of the town. A keeper of stories. A custodian of what mattered. People stopped by not only for medicine, but to ask about her grandmother's deliveries, about the time her father rode through a snowstorm to save a calf, about that night the mayor had tried to enforce silence and instead summoned a cavalry. The town had not changed overnight, but it had pivoted. Empty storefronts were reoccupied by people who no longer feared being erased. A retired blacksmith reopened his forge for weekend demonstrations. The old feed store began stocking traditional tech. Even the town's high school formed an equestrian club, meeting behind the newly built stables with saddle-worn books and borrowed gear. The rescue stable that Nick Harper worked for received more donations than it could have hoped for in a decade. With help from the community, they expanded. They took in more injured horses, ran workshops for local youth, and even hosted visiting veterans for equine therapy sessions. On a Wednesday afternoon, a large wooden plaque was installed on the front wall of McGraw Pharmacy. It read simply, "Let it not be said we forgot ourselves." Beneath the inscription, a brass emblem was mounted, the silhouette of a woman standing beside a horse. No names. Just the image. Lauren didn't ask for it. She didn't even attend the small dedication ceremony. She was inside at the time, adjusting the shelves. But afterward, she placed a small bouquet of dried lavender beneath the plaque. Her grandmother had once told her that lavender calmed even the most restless creature, man or beast. Behind her counter, a child's crayon drawing now hung in a modest white frame. The lines were clumsy, the colors wild. A stick-figure woman with a ponytail stood beside a black horse. A bright sun smiled down from the corner. Beneath it, in crooked, looping letters, "Thank you for staying." She didn't know who had left it. One morning it had simply appeared, folded and wedged into the doorframe. But she kept it there, right above the register. It reminded her what mattered more than anything, that sometimes, staying, holding the line against forgetting, was the bravest act of all. Even those who had once sided with the mayor now came quietly into the store. They didn't bring apologies. Just glances held a second longer. Grateful nods. The kind of gestures that meant more than words ever could. Mayor Drayton had not been seen much since the council's reversal. His private meetings were now public record. His proposed redevelopment plans sat dusty in a file drawer, their digital renderings forgotten. Power, when used to silence, tends to vanish when the people begin to speak. The town's politics hadn't become perfect. But they had become visible. Accountable. And in the heart of Ironville, a woman behind a wooden counter continued her work, measuring out prescriptions, ordering herbal teas for elderly customers, refilling the glass bowl of wintergreen mints even though she knew most people took two. Some days, when the afternoon sun slanted just right through the pharmacy window, the brass plaque outside would catch the light. Children would stop and stare at it, asking questions their parents hadn't expected but were grateful to answer. They would talk about history. About horses. About what it meant to protect something not because it was profitable, but because it was good. They would talk about Lauren. And Lauren, who had once believed she was the last, realized something she hadn't dared to hope. She was no longer alone. A tradition had returned. Not in nostalgia, but in breath, in hoofbeat, in the stubborn heartbeat of a town that nearly forgot who it was. And all because one person chose to act as if it still mattered. Even now, she sometimes ran her hand over the hand-stitched leather strap left on her doorstep. The words engraved into the leather had worn soft from her touch. For deliveries, the old way still matters. That simple truth had saved a town. And every first Saturday, when the streets filled once again with the quiet thunder of horses, the people of Ironville remembered why.